Today sees the release of my latest non-fiction book, The Eagle and the Lion, over here in the UK. It's coming out from Head of Zeus Publishing, and it'll be released in hardback and ebook for Kindle. Now, the same book, called Rome and Persia, will be released in the United States in September from Basic Books. And apart from the title, the cover, and a few minor details, this is exactly the same book. So even the spellings will be the British style in the American edition. So although obviously I'd encourage everybody to go out and buy this book because it's fun to read and I enjoyed writing it, you don't need to buy the two. They are exactly the same book, and I know this sometimes is confusing, particularly when the various forms of Amazon will often advertise both, but it is the same book. And it's all about the rivalry and contact between the Roman Empire and, first of all, the Parthians and then the Sasanian Persians who succeeded them. So it's a very long story. It's about conflict, it's about war, it's about competition, it's about suspicion, but it's also about diplomacy, it's about coexistence, it's about trade, the exchange of ideas, the movement of goods and people over vast distances, sometimes beginning outside either empire, going all the way through them and through the other to the other side. So it's about a bigger world, but it also has quite a grand sweep in terms of the period it covers. Because the first Roman to contact the Parthians formally was Sulla in the 90s BC. And although later on people could look back and say, well, this was a big moment in the history of Rome, in fact, at the time, it wasn't that exciting. It wasn't thought of as that exceptional. Sulla got credit for being the first person to contact the Parthians. Doing anything first was always great for the Roman aristocracy, but it wasn't considered to be a major event. And we don't even know precisely which year it occurred in, because the records aren't there, and we're working out roughly when Sulla was out there as a lesser governor, a pro-praetor, and he came into contact with an ambassador who happened to hear he was in the area when he'd intervened in Cappadocia. So from that very small beginning, you end up with contact between an empire that was, if not the equal of the Romans in terms of sheer size, in terms of population, in terms of wealth and strength, nevertheless, it was a unit that was bigger, more powerful, more significant, more sophisticated, more advanced than anybody else the Romans had contact with by this stage. You've got to remember, this is a world where the Romans have already defeated Carthage, where the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean are now very weak. Macedonia's gone, it's a Roman province. Ptolemaic Egypt has shrunk in on itself, fought itself for so much that it's really dependent on Rome. It's a subordinate ally of the Romans. It's not an equal, it's certainly not a rival. And in fact, the Ptolemies never fight the Romans. And you've got the Seleucids, who've shrunk to be a small fragment of the empire that had once existed and flourished and taken such a large chunk of Alexander the Great Empire. Now, one of the reasons they shrink is, of course, the rise of the Parthian dynasty, the Arsacid Parthians, who expand from the northern fringes into Central Asia and take over the greater part of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids are really carved up between the Romans and the Parthians, as it will turn out. And the Romans will take Syria and Judea, Palestine, areas in the west, and the Parthians will have the central area and the area to the east. And you could argue, in a sense, that one of the reasons for this rivalry is that the area of Ctesiphon, Babylonia, Seleucia on the Tigris, which is in many respects very urbanized, and some of those cities are very Greek in culture and language, perhaps has more in common with Antioch on the coast of Syria, other cities in Syria, Asia Minor, Palestine, this area, than it necessarily does with the different climate, culture, and languages of lands in Old Persia proper, further to the east. And yet they remain split for century after century. Some of them are Roman, some of them are under the Parthians or the Persians, and others are contested. But in the main, the big lesson from this story is that although there are these two great empires, and although they fight each other plenty of times, they don't try to destroy each other. The Romans never conquer the Parthians or the Persians. They take some territory from them. The Roman frontier does gradually expand in fits and starts in the, well, to some extent the 1st century BC, but particularly the first and then the second centuries AD, and even a little bit beyond. After that, some land is lost, some is regained, there is some expansion. The Sasanian Persians will take some territory back. They will often invade and plunder bits of the settled Roman provinces, but they don't ever really take. Whilst they can sack Antioch several times, they're never capable of taking it until the very end. Things change in the 7th century AD, in that last bitter war fought between the Persians and the Romans that will go on for several decades, and we'll see the Persians overrunning not just Syria but Palestine and Egypt, and having an army within sight of Constantinople more than once, even though it can't cross the Dardanelles. But its allies, the Avars, will take part in a major siege of Constantinople, where it looks for a while as if the Eastern Roman Empire is going to be utterly defeated and effectively extinguished. That doesn't quite happen, and the Romans manage to recover, and the Persian war effort loses its way, the King of Kings loses support, and the Romans manage to turn things round and win that war, and regain the lost territory. But within a few years, the Islamic Arab armies expand very suddenly, the remaining Sasanian Persian Empire is overrun and destroyed, and taken over, and most of those provinces the Romans had lost before to the Persians, they lose just as quickly to the Arab armies, and they never get them back. So the world has changed profoundly by the end of the 7th century AD, and the Roman Empire is now a strong medieval kingdom, but it isn't even something compared to the might of a century ago, of the time of Justinian or something like that, when it could think of reclaiming the lost lands to the west, and went a long way to reclaiming those around the Mediterranean, even though ultimately it couldn't hold on to them. Where it was still a very great power, it becomes simply a strongish kingdom whose strength varies depending on local circumstances, the abilities of the ruler at the time, and internal stability and external threats. But the Sasanian Persian Empire has gone. It's no longer there. The last few Sasanian princes we hear of are in Chinese service. They fled that far, perhaps dreaming and at least on one occasion attempting to retake their empire, but it's never realistic. They simply haven't got the capacity to do it. They haven't got the strength to do it. One noticeable thing, and one reason why I treat in the book the Parthians and the Sasanian Persians as essentially two different dynasties that control the same empire, is that some of the Parthian noble houses not only continue right the way through Sasanian rule, but they're still there, locally influential and significant after the Arab conquest. Within the Arab kingdoms, they are important for quite a long time. So you can see the continuity of local powers, local nobility, local kings, because there is a reason why the Parthian and the Persian king is titled the King of Kings. There are lots of lesser monarchs within the area that govern their different regions, their different kingdoms, generation after generation after generation. And there are other powerful local grandees who do much the same thing, whether or not they're actually called king. So you look at the Persian Empire and Parthian Empire before it, and you look at the Roman Empire, and in many respects, they're different. Rome is very much a world of cities. It thinks that way. The Greco-Roman idea of the polis, the city-state, is profoundly important. But it's also striking when there are areas like that. There are heavily urbanized areas within the Parthian and Persian Empire, but there are others where it's simply the circumstances, the economy, the country is not favorable, nor is it culturally suitable. And yet these areas thrive just as well, and they are strong and they are sophisticated. So this is a story of competition between two rivals who in many ways seem to get more and more alike. And by the 4th century AD, a Roman emperor will address the King of Kings as brother. They will, at least in diplomacy, grant them the status of equals and vice versa. And this will become more pronounced as time goes on, because realistically, the Eastern Empire is still a bit stronger, a bit wealthier, a bit more powerful than the Persians, but the difference compared to the united entire Roman Empire is significantly less. So it's a story of two empires that become very alike, and militarily you can see this periods of one side gaining an advantage, but then the other catches up. They work out a way to counter the enemy's advantages, or they copy them. and they get more and more similar, so that by the time you look at the later armies, there's really a lot less to choose between them than the apparent contrast I've talked about in the earlier video about the Battle of Carrhae between the legionary fighting on foot and the Parthian horse archers and cataphracts on horseback. It isn't simple, it isn't static. Neither of these empires has got to be such a successful empire by being terribly inefficient. They learn from their mistakes, they copy, they adapt, they are strong, they are good at exercising power, they are good at fighting. But the interesting thing is these two expansionist empires don't ever make a concerted effort to expand into each other's territory to destroy the other, with the exception of the Persians in that last conflict in the 7th century AD. So there's a lot going on in this long period that the book covers, even though sometimes we'll see wars fought in much the same way, over much the same terrain and territory in the same country, time and time again, generation after generation. There's also a lot of adaptation, a lot of change. So this is the story of The Eagle and the Lion, or as it would be called from September onwards when the American edition is released, Rome and Persia. And I hope you enjoy it.